Sometimes the cruelest insult isn't spoken in anger. It's spoken with a smile, in front of everyone who matters, while the person you love quietly watches you disappear. My wife just meant I drove Grandpa here all the time. That was what my cousin whispered to me after the room went awkwardly silent. He was trying to soften the blow. It didn't. The words still hung over the chapel like dust caught in sunlight. He's just the driver. Not my husband. Not Nathan. Not the grandson who had spent every Tuesday evening bringing an old man to his doctor's appointments. Just the driver. A few people chuckled politely, unsure whether Olivia had been joking. Others looked away, pretending to study the flower arrangements surrounding my grandfather's casket. In moments like that, decent people rarely defend you. They simply become fascinated by the floor. I stood beside the polished oak coffin, my black tie pulled just a little too tight around my neck. The scent of lilies mixed with old wood and candle wax, filling the chapel with the familiar smell that every funeral somehow shares. Outside, a gray October sky pressed low over the cemetery, and a cold wind rattled the stained glass windows. My grandfather, William Brooks, always hated unnecessary noise. It was strangely fitting that the loudest thing inside the chapel wasn't crying. It was humiliation. Olivia adjusted the sleeve of her designer black coat, as though nothing unusual had happened. Her smile never disappeared. She greeted distant relatives, shook hands with business partners who had flown in from Chicago and Dallas, and thanked people for attending. Every introduction sounded almost identical. This is Senator Collins. This is Mr. Harper from the Foundation. And this, she said with another practiced smile, gently touching my arm without ever looking at me, is just the driver. Grandpa always preferred Nathan behind the wheel. A few more quiet laughs. Someone muttered, "That's funny." It wasn't. The strange thing about public humiliation is that it doesn't arrive all at once. It settles, first in your chest, then your throat, finally your silence. I didn't argue. I didn't pull my arm away. I simply nodded once and stepped back toward the last row of chairs. People often imagine pride exploding into shouting. Mine always became quieter. At 42 years old, I'd learned something life teaches most men eventually. Not every battle deserves an audience. The minister continued speaking about legacy, family, sacrifice, and honor. His voice echoed softly through the chapel, but I barely heard a word. My eyes remained fixed on my grandfather's portrait beside the casket. He was smiling in that photograph. Not the stiff smile people force for formal portraits. His real one. The smile he wore whenever we'd spend Saturday mornings fixing old pickup trucks behind his ranch house, our hands covered in grease while he insisted every machine, and every man, deserved patience before judgment. He used to tell me something over and over. Character isn't measured when people clap for you, son. It's measured when they laugh. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Standing inside that chapel, I realized he'd been talking about life. Behind me, another conversation drifted through the room. I heard William left an enormous estate. Think the company goes to Uncle Richard? No, probably gets divided. I doubt Nathan's involved. I almost smiled. Almost. For years I'd become accustomed to people assuming I contributed very little to the Brooks family beyond showing up quietly and leaving even more quietly. Olivia certainly believed it. To her, I was dependable, predictable, comfortable, useful when luggage needed carrying or someone needed driving across town. Nothing more. She'd never asked why Grandpa insisted I personally drove him everywhere despite having chauffeurs available. She never wondered why he canceled meetings unless I accompanied him. Curiosity requires respect. Contempt never asks questions. The final hymn ended. One by one, guests rose from their seats. The minister thanked everyone for coming. Several relatives began walking toward the cemetery outside where the burial would continue. Then something unexpected happened. Before anyone reached the chapel doors, a calm voice broke the quiet. "Excuse me." Every head turned. A silver-haired man in a charcoal suit slowly stood near the front pew, holding a thick leather folder against his chest. I recognized him immediately. Michael Carter, my grandfather's attorney for nearly 30 years. He waited until every conversation faded before speaking again. "I'd like to ask everyone to remain seated." People exchanged confused glances. Someone checked their watch. Another sighed impatiently. Mr. Carter looked around the chapel with the same composed expression he'd worn every time I'd met him. Then he said the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. Mr. William Brooks left one final instruction. The room fell silent. He specifically requested that no one leave this chapel until every person named in his final letter is present. For the first time that morning, Olivia's confident smile faltered. Nobody moved, not because they respected Michael Carter, because everyone wanted to know whether William Brooks had left behind one final surprise. The old attorney waited with remarkable patience, his weathered hands resting lightly on the leather folder as conversations slowly dissolved into silence. Outside, I could hear the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the cemetery, followed by the soft tapping of rain against the stained glass windows. The funeral had already felt unusually heavy. Now the air itself seemed unwilling to move. Olivia leaned slightly toward me without making eye contact. "Do you know what this is about?" she whispered. I looked ahead. No, it wasn't a lie. At least, not entirely. Michael cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his calm voice carrying effortlessly through the chapel. "Mr. William Brooks instructed me that before his final testament is read, everyone named within it must be physically present in this room." A murmur spread through the pews. My Uncle Richard frowned. "Why can't we do this at the firm's office tomorrow?" Michael shook his head. "Because those were Mr. Brooks' exact instructions." He reached inside the folder but didn't remove the will. Not yet. Instead, he unfolded a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. "There is a letter." That sentence changed the atmosphere again. People expect wills to list money. Nobody expects them to begin with a personal letter. Across the room, my Aunt Denise quietly folded her arms. Cousins exchanged curious glances. Several executives who had attended out of respect looked uncertain whether they should remain. Michael answered that question before anyone asked it. "If your name appears in this letter, Mr. Brooks specifically requested that you hear every word." No one stood. No one reached for the door. I remained where I was near the last row, watching rain slide slowly down the chapel windows. Grandpa always believed anticipation revealed more about people than answers did. He used to pause halfway through every story, long enough for everyone else to fill the silence with assumptions. I smiled to myself. Even now, he was still controlling the room. William Brooks had never been the loudest man in Texas. He never needed to be. He had built Brooks Industrial Holdings over 5 decades, beginning with a single welding truck and a rented warehouse outside Fort Worth. While other businessmen chased magazine covers and television interviews, Grandpa preferred worn work boots, black coffee, and breakfast at the same roadside diner every Saturday morning. Most people knew him as a billionaire. I knew him as the old man who insisted pancakes tasted better after fixing fences. As a child, I thought every grandfather repaired broken tractors before sunrise. Every grandfather carried fence pliers in the back pocket of his jeans. Every grandfather stopped on lonely highways to help strangers change flat tires. Success never changed him. It simply gave him more opportunities to remain himself. Perhaps that was why we'd become so close. When my parents divorced during my teenage years, Grandpa quietly became the steady presence I never realized I needed. He never lectured, never raised his voice. He simply invited me to work beside him. "Bring your gloves," he'd say. "We've got fences to repair." By sunset, somehow, every problem felt smaller. He taught me business the same way he taught me ranch work. Patiently, without speeches. "You learn more listening than talking, Nathan." It became one of the few rules I never questioned. Years later, after college, everyone expected me to join Brooks Industrial as another executive in an expensive office overlooking downtown Dallas. I surprised them. I declined. Instead, I accepted something nobody else wanted: time. I spent more afternoons driving Grandpa to medical appointments, more evenings sitting beside him on the ranch porch, more weekends helping him organize old documents, family photographs, and handwritten journals dating back nearly 60 years. People assumed I'd failed to build a career. The truth was much quieter. Grandpa never corrected them. Neither did I. Across the aisle, Olivia shifted impatiently. She had married ambition long before she married me. Prestige fascinated her. Appearances mattered. Success, in her world, only counted if other people could see it. She loved introducing friends to CEOs. She loved charity galas, private clubs, luxury resorts, and conversations that began with titles instead of names. She had once asked me, only half joking, Why Grandpa insisted on living in the old ranch house when he could own 10 mansions. I remembered Grandpa laughing. A man only sleeps in one bed. She never understood why he found that funny. Looking around the chapel now, I realized something else. Most people here believed they understood William Brooks. Almost none of them actually did. Michael Carter finally opened the leather folder. Very slowly. He adjusted his glasses, looked around the room one final time, then said the sentence that caused every heartbeat in the chapel to hesitate. "Before I read the will," he said quietly, "Mr. Brooks instructed me to first explain why the person everyone underestimated became the only person he ever trusted with his final decision." No one spoke. It was as if the entire chapel had forgotten how. Michael Carter lowered his eyes to the handwritten letter before him, taking a slow breath that somehow made the silence even heavier. The rain outside intensified, tapping steadily against the stained glass windows, while distant thunder rolled across the cemetery. The world beyond the chapel seemed to disappear. "This letter," Michael said quietly, "was written by William Brooks 6 months ago." He paused, "and he instructed me to read it before anyone hears a single word of his will." Several people shifted uneasily. Uncle Richard crossed his arms. "This seems unnecessary." Michael looked up. Mr. Brooks anticipated that someone would say exactly that. A ripple of nervous laughter spread through the room before dying almost instantly. Then Michael began reading. "If you're hearing this, it means I've finally run out of tomorrows." His deep voice echoed through the chapel. "I've spent most of my life building a company. People think that was my greatest achievement. It wasn't. The company was steel. Character was always harder to build." Every eye remained fixed on the attorney. "For years, I've watched people measure one another by titles, houses, expensive watches, and the names printed on office doors. I've watched people mistake appearance for integrity. Some of them are sitting in this room today." The words landed like quiet stones in still water. Nobody smiled anymore. Michael continued, "Before I tell you who receives what I leave behind, I want everyone here to understand why I made those decisions. Money reveals people, but time exposes them." I lowered my head. Those sounded exactly like Grandpa. He had never believed wealth changed anyone, only that it removed the excuses they used to hide who they already were. The attorney folded the first page aside and reached for the next. "Nearly 10 years ago, I decided to conduct an experiment." A confused murmur swept across the room. An experiment? Even I hadn't expected those words. I stopped correcting people whenever they underestimated my grandson Nathan. Across the aisle, Olivia slowly turned toward me. The confidence she'd carried all morning had begun to fade. Michael kept reading. "People assumed he lacked ambition. They assumed he had accomplished very little. Some believed he simply drove me because he couldn't do anything more important." Another pause. I encouraged those assumptions. This time, complete silence answered the letter. I remembered the first time Grandpa had insisted I drive him instead of using the company's chauffeur. I had argued with him. "You already have professional drivers." He laughed. "I know. So why me?" "Because conversations change when there's only family in the truck." He never explained further. Now, standing inside the chapel years later, his answer finally made sense. Michael continued reading. "I asked Nathan not to defend himself. I asked him to let people believe whatever they wished." My heartbeat slowed. Very few people knew that. Not even Olivia. She had spent years assuming my silence came from weakness. In reality, it came from a promise. Grandpa had looked me straight in the eyes one evening on the ranch porch. "Can you let people misunderstand you?" I'd frowned. Why would I? Because truth has a way of arriving late. I hadn't understood him then. I did now. The attorney adjusted the papers. Every month, Nathan drove me somewhere. Doctors, lawyers, property inspections, board meetings, charity visits, family graves. Most people believed he was simply driving. Very few noticed he stayed beside me through every conversation. I could almost hear Grandpa's old pickup rattling down dusty Texas roads. Hours together, coffee from roadside diners, conversations about business, family, mistakes, forgiveness, and responsibility. He never treated those drives like errands. They were lessons. Lessons disguised as ordinary afternoons. Michael looked toward me for only a second before returning to the letter. "People assume leadership is learned in conference rooms. They're wrong. Leadership is learned while watching how someone treats waitresses, mechanics, nurses, strangers, and elderly men who can no longer walk without assistance. Several faces lowered toward the floor. The words were becoming uncomfortably personal. Then came the sentence that changed the mood inside the chapel once again. Over the last decade, many people failed my experiment. Some failed quietly, some repeatedly. One person failed this very morning. A sharp intake of breath swept across the room. Nobody needed to ask who Grandpa meant. Olivia's face turned pale. For the first time since the funeral began, she looked genuinely frightened. Michael carefully folded the handwritten letter closed, but didn't return it to the folder. Instead, he rested one hand on the thick document lying beneath it. The letter, he said softly, was only the beginning. He looked around the chapel one final time. Now, according to Mr. Brooks' instructions, he placed his fingers on the sealed envelope containing the official testament. It is time to reveal exactly what his experiment was preparing everyone for. Michael Carter broke the wax seal with deliberate care. The tiny crack of breaking wax echoed through the chapel louder than it should have. It sounded permanent, like a door closing, or another one opening. He unfolded the first page of the official testament, adjusted his glasses once more, and looked across the room before speaking. Mr. Brooks requested that I explain the purpose of his experiment before identifying his successor. That single word caught everyone's attention. Successor. Not beneficiary. Not heir. Successor. Uncle Richard immediately leaned forward. The company already has a board. Michael nodded. It does. The board expected to choose the next chairman. It did. Another pause. But Mr. Brooks retained final authority. Every executive sitting near the front exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time, this no longer sounded like an ordinary reading of a will. It sounded like the beginning of a corporate transition. Michael turned another page. William Brooks established 3 private evaluations over the last decade. He continued reading. The first measured competence. The second measured loyalty. The third measured character under sustained misunderstanding. Someone quietly whispered, "Misunderstanding." Michael didn't answer. The letter did. A person who constantly needs recognition eventually begins making decisions for applause instead of principle. A leader must be comfortable being underestimated. Those words settled heavily inside me. I remembered dozens of afternoons when Grandpa had deliberately introduced me without mentioning my last name. Sometimes I was simply Nathan. Sometimes I was the driver. Sometimes I was the young man helping me today. Investors assumed I worked for him. Hotel staff thought I was an assistant. Restaurant managers believed I handled transportation. Grandpa never corrected them. Neither did I. Looking back, every one of those moments had been another lesson. Another test. Another quiet observation. Michael continued. Mr. Brooks documented each evaluation personally. He reached into the leather folder and placed 3 weathered notebooks on the small wooden table beside him. Gasps spread across the chapel. The notebooks were old. The leather covers were worn smooth from years of use. I have been instructed to preserve these journals as permanent family records. Nobody spoke. Everyone stared at them. Michael rested one hand on the first notebook. This one contains business evaluations. He touched the second. This one records acts of loyalty. Finally, his fingers settled on the third. And this one, he looked around the room, contains names. A chill passed through the chapel. Names. What kind of names? Michael opened the third journal. I will not read every entry. Mr. Brooks considered many of them private. He slowly turned several pages. I will, however, read one. The room became perfectly still. He found the page he wanted. Dated. Signed. Neatly handwritten. October 14th. Nathan arrived before sunrise after driving 3 hours through a storm because I mentioned over the phone that my arthritis was making it difficult to repair the north fence. He never knew I had already hired a contractor. He repaired the fence anyway. Never complained. Never asked for reimbursement. Never mentioned it again. Michael looked up. Mr. Brooks attached a note beneath that entry. He read it slowly. A man who serves when nobody is watching will still serve after everyone starts watching. Silence. The rain outside had softened into a gentle rhythm, almost as though the weather itself had begun listening. Then Michael opened another page. January 22nd. Nathan spent 9 hours in a hospital waiting room. He canceled an important interview because I asked him not to leave me alone after surgery. He never told anyone. I closed my eyes. I had forgotten about that interview. Grandpa never had. Michael carefully closed the notebook. There are hundreds of entries similar to these. Across the aisle, Olivia looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Confusion. Not because she doubted the stories. Because she had never heard any of them. She had been married to me for 6 years. Yet she knew almost nothing about the life I lived whenever Grandpa called. Not because I hid it. Because she had never asked. Michael placed both hands on the table. Mr. Brooks believed actions repeated over many years reveal character more accurately than achievements announced in public. No one challenged him. No one interrupted. Even Uncle Richard remained silent. Then Michael reached beneath the journals and removed a small black velvet box. It wasn't mentioned in the paperwork. It wasn't listed with the estate documents. Its appearance surprised even me. I have one final item to present, he said quietly. This was to be opened only after everyone understood why William Brooks made the decision he did. He lifted the lid. Inside rested a single antique brass key attached to a worn leather tag. Only 2 words had been engraved into the metal. For Nathan. Every pair of eyes in the chapel turned toward me. And for the first time that morning, I realized the greatest surprise my grandfather had planned wasn't hidden inside his fortune. It was hidden behind whatever that forgotten key was meant to unlock. No one looked at the key. They looked at me. It was an uncomfortable feeling. For years, I had perfected the art of blending into the background. I was the quiet grandson who parked the truck, carried Grandpa's coat, poured his coffee, and disappeared before anyone thought to ask my opinion. Suddenly, every conversation in the chapel had stopped because of 2 engraved words. For Nathan. Michael Carter closed the velvet box without another explanation. The key, he said calmly, will make sense in a few moments. Uncle Richard's patience finally broke. Enough with the riddles, Michael. His voice echoed through the chapel. If Father intended to leave instructions, then read the will. Several relatives nodded in agreement. They weren't grieving anymore. They were calculating. Michael remained perfectly composed. I am. He lifted the official testament from the folder. This document contains several declarations. The first concerns Brooks Industrial Holdings. A dozen executives instinctively straightened in their seats. The second concerns the Brooks Family Trust. More uneasy glances. And the third concerns succession. That word returned. Succession. Not inheritance. Not distribution. Leadership. Michael unfolded another page. As of today's date, William Brooks retained controlling voting authority over every family entity, including Brooks Industrial Holdings, the Brooks Family Trust, Brooks Foundation, and all associated investment partnerships. No one seemed surprised. Everyone already knew Grandpa controlled the empire. What they didn't know was what came next. Upon my death, Michael read slowly. All controlling voting authority shall transfer immediately to one individual. The room became impossibly still. Someone's phone vibrated before being hurriedly silenced. Rainwater slid down the stained glass windows in slow streams, distorting the gray cemetery beyond. Olivia quietly reached for my hand. It was the first affectionate gesture she'd made all morning. I didn't pull away. I also didn't return it. Michael continued. This transfer shall not be divided. A faint gasp escaped Aunt Denise. Not divided? She whispered. No, Michael answered, lowering the page. Mr. Brooks specifically prohibited dividing executive authority. The significance of that sentence spread across the room almost instantly. This wasn't simply about money. Whoever inherited control would effectively determine the future of a multi-billion-dollar family enterprise. Uncle Richard forced a smile. Well, he said confidently, Father always believed in experienced leadership. Several board members nodded. Richard had served as executive vice president for nearly 20 years. Most people assumed the decision had already been made long ago. Michael resumed reading. I have watched intelligent people mistake position for leadership. Managing departments is not the same as carrying responsibility. Responsibility begins when no one notices you're carrying it. Those words struck me harder than anyone else. I remembered every quiet drive, every doctor's appointment, every late-night phone call, every ranch repair, every conversation that had seemed ordinary. Grandpa had never once told me I was being prepared. He had simply trusted me with one responsibility after another until carrying them became natural. Michael reached the final paragraph on the page. His voice became even steadier. The individual receiving control has already demonstrated loyalty without contracts, patience without recognition, judgment without applause, compassion without witnesses. The chapel was silent enough to hear people breathing. Even Olivia's fingers tightened slightly around my sleeve. Then Michael stopped. He folded the page. Not because he had finished, because he wanted everyone listening. There is one additional instruction. He reached into the folder again. This time he removed a sealed envelope bearing Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting. Across the front, written in bold black ink, were 7 words. Open only after everyone chooses an heir. Confusion swept through the room. Uncle Richard frowned. What does that mean? Michael looked around the chapel. It means Mr. Brooks wanted one final demonstration. He placed the envelope on the table but made no move to open it. Before I reveal his decision, each immediate family member is required to publicly state who they believe should inherit control of the Brooks legacy. The room erupted into murmurs. It was brilliant. Grandpa wasn't merely leaving an inheritance. He was creating one final test. A test no one had expected. Richard stood first. The obvious choice is experience. Aunt Denise agreed almost immediately. My brother has earned it. One by one, voices joined the same chorus. Board members, relatives, longtime associates. Nearly everyone pointed toward Richard. No one mentioned my name. Not once. I stood quietly at the back of the chapel, exactly where everyone expected me to remain. Then Michael turned toward Olivia. Mrs. Brooks. She looked startled. As Nathan's wife, he said, Mr. Brooks specifically requested that your opinion be heard before the envelope is opened. Every face in the room shifted toward her. She swallowed once. Then, believing the answer was obvious, she took a slow breath and said the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. My husband, she said with an awkward laugh. No, Nathan isn't that person. He was never meant to lead something like this. The silence that followed Olivia's words was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of grief. It was the silence that comes after someone unknowingly steps onto thin ice. Olivia realized it almost immediately. She forced an uneasy smile, glancing around the room as though waiting for someone to laugh with her. Nobody did. She tried again. She said, clearing her throat. Nathan is kind and dependable, but running a company like Brooks Industrial takes experience. Her voice became steadier as she continued. It requires leadership. It requires vision. And that's simply never been his role. She thought she was being practical, reasonable, objective. Every sentence sounded perfectly logical. Every sentence cut a little deeper. I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Grandpa's portrait. Years earlier, he had once asked me a strange question while we sat on the ranch porch watching the sunset. If the person closest to you doesn't truly see you. He paused before finishing. Whose blindness is it? At the time, I hadn't answered. Standing inside the chapel, I finally understood the question. Michael Carter folded his hands. Mrs. Brooks, he said politely, is that your final opinion? Olivia nodded. Yes. My husband has many good qualities, but he isn't the person William intended to succeed him. Michael simply inclined his head. Thank you. Nothing more. No argument. No expression. No hint of what would come next. He picked up the sealed envelope William Brooks had prepared for this exact moment. The words written across the front suddenly carried a very different weight. Open only after everyone chooses an heir. Slowly, he broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten page. He unfolded it with extraordinary care. I will now read Mr. Brooks' final instruction before announcing his successor. The room became motionless. If you are hearing this, Michael began. Then every important person in my family has already revealed what they truly believe. A chill swept through the chapel. No one was forced. No one was tricked. Everyone answered freely. He turned the page slightly, especially Olivia. Every head turned toward my wife. Her expression changed instantly. She stared at Michael, then at the letter, then at me. Michael continued. Olivia, if you said Nathan wasn't capable, then you have spent years loving only the version of him that was convenient for you, not the man he truly became. Olivia's lips parted. She whispered my name. Nathan. I remained silent. Michael kept reading. You saw the truck. You never asked where it went. You saw the hospital visits. You never asked what decisions were being made. You saw the late-night meetings. You assumed they were errands. You saw humility. and mistook it for a lack of ability. Every sentence struck with surgical precision. No accusation, just truth. The most painful kind. I remembered dozens of evenings arriving home long after dark. Olivia would ask only one question. Did your grandfather need another ride? I'd answer yes. She would nod and return to whatever she had been doing. The conversation always ended there. Not once had she asked what Grandpa and I talked about during those endless hours together. Not once. Michael lowered the letter for a moment. I have known William Brooks for 32 years, he said quietly. I can honestly say this is the most personal document he ever entrusted to me. Then he continued reading. Nathan honored every promise he ever made to me. One promise required complete silence. I instructed him never to explain himself. Not to family. Not to business partners. Not even to his own wife. Gasps echoed across the chapel. Olivia looked at me in disbelief. You knew? She whispered. You could have told me. For the first time that afternoon, I answered her directly. I promised him I wouldn't. Her eyes filled with tears. So all these years, you let me believe. I nodded gently. Yes. Because I gave him my word. She shook her head as though trying to reject reality itself. Everything she believed about our marriage was collapsing in front of hundreds of witnesses. Not because I had deceived her, because she had never cared enough to ask. Michael unfolded the final section of the letter. His voice became softer, almost affectionate. Nathan, if this letter reaches you, then you've kept your promise. You've carried misunderstanding longer than anyone should have to. That tells me everything I needed to know. Michael looked directly at me. Then he smiled for the first time all afternoon. Mr. Brooks concluded that no further tests were necessary. He placed the handwritten letter beside the unopened testament. There was only one declaration left to read. The declaration that would permanently change not only the future of the Brooks family, but the identity everyone in that chapel believed I had worn for the last 10 years. Michael Carter lifted the final page of the testament. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. Not because he needed time to read, because he understood that once these words were spoken, there would be no putting them back. The Brooks family would never be the same again. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting streaks of blue and gold across the chapel floor. Grandpa would have appreciated the timing. He always said storms never lasted forever. Michael finally spoke. Article 7. His voice was calm, steady. Upon my death, all controlling voting shares of Brooks Industrial Holdings, all executive authority within the Brooks Family Trust, all voting rights attached to Brooks Foundation, and all decision-making authority previously reserved to me. He paused. Shall transfer immediately and permanently. Every eye in the room remained fixed on him. To my grandson. Another pause. Nathan Brooks. No one breathed. For several long seconds, absolute silence filled the chapel. It wasn't disbelief. It was shock struggling to become reality. Then came the sound. Not applause. Not congratulations. A chair scraping violently across the floor. Uncle Richard stood so abruptly that it nearly tipped backward. That's impossible. His face had gone pale. There has to be some mistake. Michael didn't react. There is no mistake. Richard shook his head furiously. I've spent 22 years running this company. I negotiated acquisitions. I expanded operations. I sat beside Father in every board meeting. And he leaves everything too. His eyes landed on me. The driver? Michael calmly corrected him. No. He left everything to the man who spent 10 years proving he never needed the title. The room fell silent again. Olivia looked as though she had forgotten how to blink. Her eyes moved between me and the testament over and over again, trying to force the two realities together. The husband she believed she knew. The man Grandpa had actually chosen. They no longer matched. Michael continued reading. Nathan shall assume the position of executive chairman effective immediately. No board vote shall be required. No family approval shall be required. This decision is final. One executive quietly lowered his head. Another removed his glasses. They all understood what those sentences meant. The company had already changed hands. Nothing anyone said today could reverse it. Michael folded the testament. There is one final instruction. He picked up the small velvet box containing the brass key. This key belongs to a private office beneath the original ranch house. I frowned. The original ranch house? I had spent half my life there. I'd never known such an office existed. Michael smiled faintly. Neither did anyone else. He handed me the box. As soon as the cool brass touched my hand, memories flooded back. Grandpa disappearing into the barn for an hour. Old blueprints he refused to discuss. The locked cellar door I had always assumed led only to storage. Suddenly, dozens of forgotten moments began connecting themselves. The office, Michael explained, contains 50 years of journals. Every major business strategy, every handwritten lesson, every unfinished project, and every personal letter Mr. Brooks wanted only Nathan to read. A quiet gasp spread across the room. This wasn't merely an inheritance. It was a lifetime of mentorship continuing beyond death. Michael reached into his briefcase one final time. There is also this. He placed a leather-bound appointment book into my hands. Inside the cover, written in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, were only 9 words. Monday, 8 o'clock. Don't keep them waiting again. I looked up. What meeting? Michael smiled. The board. I stared at him. The board thinks they're meeting to elect a new chairman. He paused just long enough for everyone else to understand. They don't yet know they've already elected one years ago. Across the chapel, several executives exchanged nervous looks. They weren't wondering whether I could lead. Grandpa had already answered that question. They were wondering whether they had unknowingly been interviewed every time they had dismissed the quiet man standing beside William Brooks. I closed the appointment book carefully. For years, I had believed I was simply keeping an old man company, helping him with errands, listening to stories, repairing fences, driving dusty Texas roads. Now I understood. Every drive had been a board meeting. Every breakfast had been a strategy session. Every conversation had been another lesson in leadership disguised as ordinary life. Grandpa never trained me by placing me in the spotlight. He trained me where character grows best, far away from applause. As the chapel slowly filled with whispers, Olivia finally stepped toward me. Her voice trembled. Nathan. She reached for my arm. I didn't know. For the first time that day, I looked directly into her eyes. There was regret in them now, real regret. But I also realized something Grandpa had understood long before I ever did. Some people only recognize your worth after someone else places a price on it. And by then, they are already too late. People began leaving the chapel in small groups, but no one spoke above a whisper. The conversations that had filled the room before the reading of the will had vanished. There were no confident predictions anymore. Only quiet speculation. Only disbelief. Executives who had ignored me for years now nodded respectfully as they passed. Family members who had barely acknowledged my existence suddenly looked at me as though they were seeing me for the first time. Nothing about me had changed. Only what they knew. I slipped the brass key into my jacket pocket and turned toward the exit. Nathan. Olivia's voice stopped me halfway down the aisle. It was softer than I had ever heard it. Almost fragile. I turned. She was standing alone beside Grandpa's portrait while everyone else slowly filtered outside into the afternoon sunlight. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she walked toward me. I owe you an apology. There were tears in her eyes now. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind that come after pride has nowhere left to hide. I've been replaying everything in my head, she whispered. The funeral. The things I said. The way I introduced you. She lowered her eyes. Just the driver. The words sounded different now. Heavy. Ashamed. I can't believe I said that. I looked at the stained glass window behind her. I can. She flinched. Not because I raised my voice. Because I didn't. I didn't mean it that way, she said quickly. I was nervous. I wasn't thinking. I nodded slowly. I know. She stepped closer. But that's not who I am. I thought about that. Grandpa used to tell me something every autumn when we repaired fences together. The first words people reach for under pressure. He would tighten another strand of wire before continuing. Usually belong to the person they've been all along. Back then I thought he was talking about business negotiations. Now I realized he had been talking about life. Olivia reached for my hand. This time I gently stepped back. The movement wasn't angry. It wasn't meant to punish her. It was simply honest. I never asked who you really were, she admitted. I only cared about who everyone else thought you were. I appreciated the truth in those words. For the first time in years, she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't making excuses. She was finally seeing the problem clearly. I kept wishing you were more ambitious, she continued. I wanted everyone to admire us. I wanted the perfect image. She laughed bitterly through her tears. And all along, she looked directly at me. I was married to the man everyone else should have admired. I remained silent, not because I wanted her to suffer, because there wasn't anything left to explain. Everything Grandpa had hidden for 10 years had already spoken louder than either of us ever could. She wiped her eyes. Can we start over? It was such a simple question, one I had imagined hearing many times during our marriage. Yet standing there in the quiet chapel, it felt strangely distant. I don't know, I answered honestly. I've spent years trying to become someone you could respect. I smiled sadly. It turns out I already was. She closed her eyes. The truth hurt more than anger ever could. Just then, Michael Carter approached us carrying a small leather case. I'm sorry to interrupt. He handed it to me. Mr. Brooks left one final item that wasn't part of the estate. I opened the case. Inside rested an old digital recorder. The label attached to it read, "Play only after the chapel is empty." I looked around. Nearly everyone had already left. Only Michael, Olivia, and I remained. Michael quietly walked outside without another word, gently closing the chapel doors behind him. The room became still once again. Only the ticking of an old clock echoed through the sanctuary. Olivia looked at the recorder. Is that? I nodded. His voice. My fingers hesitated over the play button. Grandpa had written letters. He had left journals. But hearing his voice again, that was different. That was final. I pressed play. Static filled the room for a brief second. Then came the familiar sound of Grandpa laughing softly. Well, Nathan, he began. If you're listening to this, then I was right about almost everything. Even after death, his voice carried the same warmth that had filled thousands of miles of dusty Texas roads. I closed my eyes. For one last time, my grandfather was about to teach me something only he could have known. Grandpa's voice filled the empty chapel. Older, softer, but unmistakably his. Nathan, he said with a quiet chuckle. If you're hearing this, then you've probably got that confused look on your face. Despite everything, I smiled. He knew me too well. I imagine everyone finally knows who you are. He paused. But I hope you remember something important. They didn't change today. Their information did. I looked toward the stained glass windows where the afternoon sunlight now reached almost to the altar. Grandpa continued. Never confuse respect earned through truth with admiration borrowed from power. If they only discovered your value after reading my will, then they never truly saw you. The recorder clicked softly before continuing. And that's all right. Most people only learn to recognize diamonds after someone else tells them the price. I laughed quietly through tears. That sounded exactly like him. Always able to wrap wisdom inside ordinary words. He went on. I didn't build Brooks Industrial because I wanted the biggest company. I built it because I wanted to prove decent people could still lead. I chose you because you never chased my chair. You spent 10 years making sure I could stay in it. The words settled deep inside me. Across the chapel, Olivia remained standing silently. She listened to every sentence, every truth, every lesson. Grandpa's voice softened even more. Now I need one final promise. Don't become the man everyone suddenly expects. Remain the man you already are. The one who holds doors. The one who remembers names. The one who listens longer than he speaks. If success changes your character, then my experiment failed. The recorder fell silent for several seconds. I thought it had ended. Then Grandpa spoke one last time. Oh, I almost forgot. A small laugh. Tell Michael he still owes me $20. Even Michael, standing quietly outside the chapel doors, laughed when he heard it through the open doorway. Then came the final words. I'm proud of you, son. Click. Silence. The recording was over. I stood there for a long time holding the recorder in both hands. Not because I didn't know what to do next. Because I knew exactly what I had lost. No inheritance could replace that voice. No company could replace that man. Several days later, I unlocked the hidden office beneath the ranch with Grandpa's brass key. It wasn't filled with treasure. It was filled with notebooks, maps, letters, coffee-stained legal pads, photographs, ideas written on napkins, half-finished speeches, margins covered with reminders like, call Nathan, ask about his mother, fix West Fence, remember kindness first. The greatest businessman I had ever known had left behind a room full of humanity. Monday morning arrived exactly as the appointment book promised. At 8 o'clock, I walked into the Brooks Industrial boardroom. The same executives who once mistook me for a driver stood as I entered. Not because they feared me, because Grandpa had taught them who I was. I didn't give a grand speech. I simply thanked them for coming. Then I asked the janitor whether his wife had recovered from surgery. Grandpa would have asked first. The meeting began. Business continued. Life moved forward. A month later, Olivia came to the ranch. She wasn't wearing expensive clothes. She brought no gifts, no rehearsed speech, only honesty. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today," she said. "I just wanted you to know. I finally understand what I lost." I believed her. For the first time, I truly did. But understanding arrives after choices have already been made. Some lessons cost too much to reverse. We spoke for nearly an hour before she quietly left. There was no dramatic reunion, no angry argument. Only two people accepting that love cannot survive forever without respect. That evening I sat alone on Grandpa's old porch watching the Texas sunset paint the fields gold. The same porch where he had taught me that leadership begins long before titles. The same porch where I once believed I was only keeping an old man company. The wind carried the familiar scent of cedar and rain. For a moment, I could almost hear his laugh again. People still ask me what it felt like to inherit a fortune. They're always surprised by my answer. The greatest thing my grandfather ever gave me wasn't his company. It wasn't his land. It wasn't even his name. He gave me 10 quiet years proving that a person's character is what they are when nobody believes they're important. Everything else, including the title of just the driver, was simply part of the road that led me home.